Pues bien, como nos mencionó el doctor José Manuel, damos inicio al panel Mirada a la Experiencia Africana de Integración, en el cual contaremos con la participación de Elia Muni, investigador trademark, y Olabisi Akinkugbe de Dalhousie University. Panel que moderará Jerónimo Delgado, director de Estudios Africanos de la Universidad Externado de Colombia.
Muy bien, muy buenos días a todos. ¿Me oyen bien? ¿Me están oyendo? Buenos días. Por favor, confírmenos si se oye. Perfecto. En el chat me confirmaron. Perfecto, muy bien. Este panel es en inglés, entonces voy a pasar a idioma inglés para que nuestros invitados nos puedan entender, ¿vale? Good morning, everybody. My name is Jerónimo Delgado, and I will be moderating this panel with the name Exploring the African Experience in Integration. We will start with Professor Olabisi Akinkugbe. I'm sorry if I say it wrong. He is the Purdue Crawford Chair in Business Law and an Associate Professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. He holds a PhD from the University of Ottawa, an LLM from the University of Toronto, and an LLB from the University of Lagos in Nigeria. His research focuses on public international law, international economic law, human rights, and regional economic integration in Africa, with a critical approach rooted in social legal studies, post-colonialism, and third world approaches to international law. Professor Akinkugbe will be talking about trade agreements and industrialization in Africa. Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, I must thank you very much, Jerónimo. You called my name very well.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to all the organizers for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person, but I must also apologize because I teach in the next 40 minutes. So I'll make my presentation hang around and come back later in the day to continue with you. Look, there's little to be said of the fact that Latin American countries and the Caribbean countries, like African countries, have a history that is checkered, a history that is deeply rooted in colonialism, a history that continues to be rooted in neocolonial economic relations. And I think even though many scholars have spoken to this past, we cannot leave it out in our discussions of economic integration, analysis of industrialization, and the growing integration through regional trade agreements on the continent. And so in the few minutes that I have, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that history. I won't take it for granted that everybody is familiar with the division across the African terrain. And so while you have the West Africa, the East Africa, the Southern Africa, the North Africa, something that is very critical to understanding the past of African countries and indeed the present is the fact that the region is very heterogeneous. And so one cannot and should not homogenize the analysis of industrialization or industrial policy in the region. That's the first point I'd like to put on the table. If you think about the fact that we have 54 countries in this area with deeply divided past around, French, Lusophone, Anglophone, deeply embedded distrust because of the past that they've had in economic integration, but also the past that derives from colonialism, then you will understand that our past really foreshadows our present. But what were we like historically in our economic integration aspirations? Coming out of the colonial era, many of these states formed very many regional organizations. At some points, there were so many of them, they were described as way too many to even be meaningful. But today, what we have is about 8 regional economic organizations that are recognized by the African Union to shepherd economic integration in the continent. Historically, though, the economic trade between these countries in the formal sense have been poor. Whereas the formal sense have been poor, the informal trading between the regions have actually been very active. Now, scholarship on this aspect hasn't always covered the informal aspect, but that's not the conversation today. Today is about industrialization. And so, as many of you know, African countries like Latin American counterparts in the Caribbean were producers of many, many primary products, many agricultural products at the primary level, where the things that traded in mostly in the 70s, late 60s, and early 80s. One thing that was critical, though, is that they never went past the production stage of this, the extraction stage of these items. And so if you think about the language of global value chain supply system today, these countries were at the bottom of this particular value chain. So manufacturing industry, textile industry, industrialization in all the technical aspects did not really take off, even though they continued to trade with their former colonizers. But if we pivot into the future that they thought of at the time, which is our own present today, different questions animate how we think about industrial policy or industrialization in Africa today. To put it in context, whereas one thinks of the past in the context of colonial and immediate neo-colonial relations, in the context of primary producers of extractive products that were sold, in the context of the fact that we never really industrialized in the sense that we had manufacturing companies or even other types of global value chain system that we supplied to the global village. Today, we have a different regime. While colonialism has ended, we have the geopolitics of trade today. The geopolitics of trade today means we have the powerful economic states like the US region of the European Union, we have China, we have Russia, all jostling for a stake in Africa. But it would be different if the stake they were jostling for in Africa is about the products that we have. Not just the primary products that we produce as a result of extraction, but something that we have been able to manufacture as a region. The shameful thing, which is unfortunate and which is detrimental to the goal of economic integration, which I'll tie back in a short while, is the fact that Africa, at its major stake, continues to be a supplier of primary products. But what primary products are we supplying today? Well, critical raw materials that are needed for environmentally sustainable products is at its peak today. And so you see the presence of cobalt extraction in Congo. You see a lot of it going on in other parts in Southern Africa, in Eastern Africa. In Nigeria, you see a lot of extraction going on as well for uranium in Niger, amongst other regions. The sad thing, the common theme between the past and the present is that aside from just the change in the diversity of extractive materials that African countries produce, they haven't been able to leverage on them, right? And while pockets of countries are trying, that hasn't taken off as well. Well, what has happened in the region of economic integration, you might ask? Unlike the cobweb or the spider web of regional integration agreements that we had in the past, today, African countries have what is called the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Now, unlike the regionally based agreements, this particular one attempts to homogenize the entire continent under a particular market. And the hope is that that will provide African countries with better leverage to be able to negotiate trade terms with other regions in the world. This agreement has not replaced the existence or has not displaced the existence of the 8 regional economic bodies that we had. We continue to have them, and the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement recognizes that the pre-existing regional economic communities will be its building blocks. Okay, so that's the relationship between them, and that's to the extent that the legal developments in the regional economic communities have been more advanced than the AFCFTA. The regional economic communities' legal regime will prevail in the event of conflict. But that's not where it ends. You might ask, so how's that agreement faring? Well, one thing that has happened is today we have almost 40 countries, or a little above 40 countries, that have now domesticated this agreement. They have ratified it. And that's great, but that's not where it ended. Trading has also commenced in a very limited fashion. Under this particular agreement, there's what is called the Guided Trade Initiative, which certain countries have signed on to. I think as at the last count, we had about 6 or 7 of them that has agreed. Nigeria is there, Kenya is there, South Africa is there, Ghana is there. And the idea is to gradually build, as they continue to negotiate other key areas that matter for trading to happen in this region. And so looking at today, and if you want to ask me, if we think about industrialization in the African context, where are we today? I would say we are cautiously, I must say, I'll repeat, cautiously building the frameworks we need to be able to, number one, advance trade with each other, as opposed to trading more with the external parties, right? African countries traded less in the formal sense with themselves. They traded more with external countries, usually former colonizers. And today, a mix of China, Russia are there as well. Number two is the fact that while, there is a cautious and important building block that is being built, we need to build more intently in a very disruptive manner. Today, countries across the world are thinking about global value chain system, right? The US is saying we're going to bring back manufacturing jobs to the US. Well, African countries need to think like that. They need to think about saying these natural resources that are being extracted in our regions have to some extent be technically refined in our own countries as well, right? And I think this is where we need to think about how these agreements responding to today's geopolitical challenges might be useful. The third point, and the last point I'll leave on the table, because I'm conscious of time, is the fact that we cannot think about industrialization in Africa and its economic integration outside of the global geopolitics, right? So there is a challenge of the role of externalities once we're thinking about economic integration. And the question here is, to what extent are advanced economic powers like those in Europe, the US, and all across the world, China, Russia, disrupting the flow of economic integration in Africa? Well, you might say, is that really a useful question? Sure, it is, because if you think about the social conflicts that have ensued in Africa in recent times, at the heart of it are really discontent with continued relationships with France and those that Russia are gaining ground on, right? So we must think about this and ask ourselves to what extent are African countries, African leaders, and particularly the African Union, ensuring that this nascent idea of the AFCFTA is doing what it is supposed to do. In a nutshell, there's much to be hopeful for in terms of industrialization in Africa today. But the pattern of trading, the pattern of behavior, the way that African states have behaved leaves much to be desired if we're truly serious about industrializing as a continent. I'll leave it there for now and hope that we can have some more engagement before I have to leave in the next 14 minutes. Thank you very much, Jerónimo, for your moderation.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like to, at this point, open the floor if somebody has questions. We're having problems with the other panelist, Professor Munyi. If you're there, please let us know. If not, we can maybe go on to some questions from you, Professor.
That would be great.
Okay. I don't know if there's any questions in the public. Otherwise, I will go. All right, Professor Bisi, can I call you Professor Bisi? Professor Bisi, from Latin America, we are used to integration processes not working, and we are used to integration processes being highly affected by who's in power and what kind of politics that guy in power has, either if it's left or right or center or whatever. Why do you think, because even if Africa has many challenges still in its integration process, Africa has succeeded in organizing all 55 countries into one big integration project. The African Continental Free Trade Area is starting to work, and even there's international recognition for the African integration process, as it was invited to join the G20, for example, alongside the European Union as one of the big actors in the international world. Why do you think this is? Why do you think Africa has managed to overcome all these differences in a, as you mentioned, highly heterogeneous society and become some sort of a success story?
Thank you very much. So that's a great question, Jerónimo. So, look, I think the beginning is to say that one shouldn't suggest that there are no divisions or contending, right, economic interests. As you can imagine, all the countries will have different economic agenda, right, to go through. But I think there's a longer history here, which I've not been able to put on the table, in the sense that since the creation of the African Union in the 1960s, when it was called Organization of African Unity, to when it changed to African Union in about in the late 90s, there has been the idea that African states would actually have this single economic union, right? That will be the basis upon which it will trade. And so one key moment in that historical trajectory is the 1980s. In 1980, there was this meeting called the Lagos Plan of Action, where there was an agreement signed, which is called the Lagos Plan of Action. And the core idea is that there will be collective economic sovereignty, right, for the states, right, that are comprised in African Union at the time. Things didn't happen. You move on to 1992 or thereabouts. There was what was called the African Economic Community, which was also envisaged in this history. All of these are critical moments that has led up to this era. So that's talking about the institutional developments and the challenges along the way. One can add to that what is called the NEPAD, New Partnership for African Development, along the way as well. But you know, the getting to this moment, unlike the challenges you have in the Latin American context, it's also about the resolve that some of the African states have of the need to come together despite the division, right? As academics, it is often easier to point out the challenges with a particular regime. But what your question, which is so good, has forced me to do is to say, look, we have to account for what is good about it. And what that means is that African leaders were maybe able to put aside for a while their national economic interests to pursue a united front, right? And I've written about this. One might call it, Pan-Africanism. I've questioned the idea. Pan-Africanism doesn't mean that all African countries are together economically. It just means that they have resolved to, as much as possible, right, continue to work together. And so while, in direct response to your question, one can say it is a resolve, a collective resolve, right, that emerges from a long-standing history of commitment to reach this stage. It is only the beginning of where we want to get to, right? And that beginning is what we are seeing gradually playing out in a much more strategic way in terms of how we're going to determine what items are we going to trade in the African Continental Trade Union, right? Which items will we list as eligible for rules of origin, right? How will that work? And so on and so forth. So I hope that sheds some light on your question, but it's a great question to start with.
Thank you, Professor Bisi. I hear we have a question in the classroom.
Yes, can you hear me,
Yes,
Professor
we can.
Olabisi? And yes, so this is Natalia from the Federal University of São Paulo. Thank you very much, Professor Olabisi, for your very interesting presentation. I was wondering, because you mentioned that the African Regional Free Trade Agreement did not supersede the other 8 regional agreements that you have, right? So I was wondering, what are the challenges of, all these agreements coexisting, and how do you deal with this? So if you could just give us some thoughts about it, it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you for all the work you've done with the team leading up to this. That's another great question. So, no, it has not displaced them, right? They continue to exist, right? And so how are they working together? Number one, it is clearly recognized in the AFCFTA agreement that these regional bodies will be the building blocks, right, for the AFCFTA. But it also means that the primary trading, right, that parties used to do under the sub-regional agreements continue, right? As you can imagine, the AFCFTA's existence doesn't mean everything and every product will be on sale or will be the subject of trading between the parties. So what I didn't have time to get to is, the rules of origin, for example, of what will be traded is now, and around how it will be traded is being discussed, and some have been agreed, but other parts have not been agreed. And so to the extent that, there's that clear recognition that you continue to exist as a sub-regional body committed to your own institutional apparatus, paraphernalia, the idea here for the AFCFTA is to cascade that and look beyond as a region, right? And so the conflicts arise. And one of the things that I think is on the table for the initial review of the AFCFTA is actually this question you have asked, right? In the sense that when they drafted this, there was not a lot of clarity around how, right, if disputes ensue, under the AFCFTA, can parties decide to trigger the court system of the sub-regional bodies, or must they work under the AFCFTA, right? By the same extension, can the reverse happen, right? The AFCFTA does not have a court system. It has the normal system you have under the WTO, which is, panel, appellate body, and conciliation and consultation before all of that. And so there are questions in there that will have to be answered in the review, but the primary, maybe a short form answer to that is to say there's a recognition that there might be conflicts in some areas, but to the extent that the primary goals of the sub-regional bodies remain to attend to the immediate integration of the countries within the same region, it recognizes its continued existence, but dealing with conflicts remains one of the issues that will have to be discussed in the review, initial review of the AFCFTA, which is built for next year.
Thank you, Professor Bisi. We have another question in the classroom.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Olabisi and Jerónimo. We are in a special moment right now in the world where we have a crisis under the WTO. Those roles are not more credible. They are not working for the Global South. As I see you in Africa, I see that you have the same problems as we have in here, that we are trying to build a framework, a legal framework among us to, with the hope also to integrate our economies into the world economy. But the world economy and the world trading rules are not being fulfilled by the United States, by by China, everyone. I mean, the big powers that promised us during the Uruguay round that trade will come, we would need rules for trade open with no barriers, progressive openness. So how do you think these global South countries, like in Africa and in Latin America, should react before the WTO. Thank you so much. And it was great to have you here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, my friend and brother. You know, it's good to be in conversation with you, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this. You have asked a great question, right? Part of what we're seeing today, whether you call it deglobalization, you know, and any of those very interesting phrases that I use today, is the failure of the promises of the Euro-era, right? The idea that we were told we need to integrate into a global economy, into a world economy, that hasn't happened. You're right. If you think about the role of the special and differential treatment, what it was supposed to do, it's a failure today. If you think about the engagement of African states and maybe some Latin American states, or most of them, with the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, it's not been as robust, right? So two things I'll put on the table is that to the extent that the WTO recognizes regional trade agreements as an exception under its Article 25, all the regions in Africa and Latin America must run with that most seriously. The notion that we need to integrate into the global economy needs to be turned on its head, and we will integrate more amongst ourselves. That is what needs to happen. Europe is strong because of the basis they have amongst themselves. Now, you might say we have, as I started at the top, heterogeneous economies and all of that. But the reality is we have to rise beyond that and build, as you have rightly said, a very strong legal framework that is backed by supranational power. That is the failure we have not had. That's the failure we have confronted in the African region, right? The idea that all the institutions we put together at the center do not have this regional supranational power, right, with them. And so legal-wise, that's one thing that will aid integration, because that's what's worked in the EU, for example, despite its own diversity. Number two is integrate more with ourselves, right? It must happen. We cannot be primary producers of extractive resources that just leaves the shores of our country. They need to be cascaded into the global value chain supply system in our countries, as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown. We cannot have that second round of that, and that's what the US is reacting to when it is signing the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, which do not legally binding, but you see it's aimed to really counter the move against China in its own value chain supply system. That's my own two short answer take on that. It's a complex question. We can spend more time on it, but I'm conscious of time because I have to teach in 5 minutes. There's a question in the chat that I'd like to just try to respond to. Thank you very much, Iwan. How is foreign investment in Africa being managed to ensure that economic growth goes hand in hand with environmental protection and social well-being? Oh my goodness, that's a great question. So I write on investment law as well. Look, you and I know that one of the most contentious aspects of investment law is this failed promise of economic growth or economic development, right? There's no real empirical evidence that backs the fact that foreign direct investment matches economic growth. So we can put that on the table that for the purpose of this question, we're assuming that they work. And assuming that they work then, what I would say from the experience of Nigeria that I know so well is actually where foreign investors have operated in local communities, they have actually been significantly complicit in environmental degradation. They haven't been the primary protectors of the environment. You think about oil exploration that's been going on in Nigeria since the 1950s. And you think about the complicity of Shell, Chevron, Mobil, and many of them in that industry, and the damage that has been done to the area called Niger Delta today. It's a lot of that. Foreign direct investment hasn't done anything in that regard. You think about the exploration of gold and other extractive raw materials today, they are polluting the river. I have reports by journalists that literally show river with fish completely gone today as a result of extractive activities. So the point is, in terms of the compatibility of environmental protection and social well-being with foreign direct investment, our leaders have not been as serious. Many factors account for that. You can think about corruption. You can think about the fact that we don't have a regime that holds these leaders or these investors accountable. But you can also think about the very challenging ISDS, right? Which means, you know, they can always go there to drag the states where they deem measures that have been taken as not compatible with the spirit of the agreement, of the fair and equitable provisions of the investment agreement. So in some cases, it has worked. Where it has worked, I would say it's in the infrastructure industry, where they'll literally come build a road like the one I was involved in at once that has no significant environmental implication for the state, but that produced a social good, the road, but it also enhanced the economy around it. And while the economy around it was enhanced, the primary people who brought that economy up were not the foreign direct investors. It's actually the facilitation of the road around it that caused that. So we can talk more about all these things. I'm publicly available on my social media accounts. My email can be seen, but you know, I must thank you all for the opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you, Jerónimo, for your excellent moderation, and thank you all for the invitation as well.
Thank you, Professor Bisi. It was a pleasure having you here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Okay.
All right.
Have a nice time, guys. Bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye.
Muy bien. Voy a pasar a español ya que el profesor no está. Para concluir, quisiera, para terminar ya, leerles 4 o 5 datos que creo que son importantes cuando uno habla del proceso de integración africano. El área continental africana de libre comercio, por ejemplo, en este momento tiene 54 de los 55 países, 47 de ellos ya la ratificaron y están funcionando. ¿Esto qué significa? Significa que de aquí a 11 años, 2035, que es la fecha que se han puesto, el área africana de libre comercio pretende sacar a 30 millones de personas adicionales de la pobreza en África. Recordemos que en los últimos 20 años cerca de 400 millones de personas ya salieron de la pobreza en África. Súmenle a eso 450.000 millones de dólares en ingresos adicionales para los países africanos, un 52% del incremento en el comercio intraafricano, un 90% de bienes y servicios sin aranceles para los países firmantes. Estamos hablando de una economía de 3.4 billones de dólares combinada para todos los países de África y estamos hablando de más o menos un 7% de incremento en el PIB continental gracias al área continental de libre comercio. Termino con la siguiente frase. Cuando aquí en Colombia se da el debate de si debemos o no relacionarnos con África y de si el gobierno debe o no abrir embajadas o debe o no hacer visitas a África, a mí me causa curiosidad porque estamos frente a uno de los continentes que más va a crecer, uno de los continentes que más nos está enseñando en términos de integración y en términos de superación de los problemas asociados al desarrollo para países del sur global, y nosotros seguimos con la pregunta de si vale la pena o no mirar a África. Evidentemente vale la pena mirar a África y estoy seguro que África va a ser sin duda una gran inspiración para el proceso de integración colombiano. Muchas gracias y terminamos el panel acá. Feliz día.